Gang is a 1974 Western directed by Richard Fleischer and stars Lee Marvin, Gary Grimes, Ron Howard, and Charles Martin Smith. When three farm boys discover a wounded man, they nurse him back to health and then learn he is the infamous outlaw Harry Spikes. Their admiration for him eventually leads to them joining up with him and learning the ways of how to be a bank robber. The Spikes Gang is a really interesting film. Going in, I wasn't sure what to expect. It's a 70s Western, so that being said, I didn't know if it would lean more towards the revisionist side or more the classical portrayal of the West. And I think it kind of rides a line between those two. Its main characters all ultimately end up as outlaws, but it doesn't glorify that fact or paint it in a particularly favorable light. It is a bit darker and grittier than what would be usual for a more typical Western, but it's also not a horrible, depressing view of living on the frontier. The tone varies between that of an adventure early on, shifting into harsh reality being brought before our characters, and then back and forth like that for the rest of the movie. But even if the tone is a little uneven, the reason I think that works is the performances. And to start off with, Lee Marvin is amazing in this film, as Harry Spikes. His performance is so interesting to watch because he draws you in and makes you like him to a degree. I think of Lee Marvin in movies usually as a quite intimidating presence. He played so many either villains or just hard-nosed tough guys, so early on I was kind of afraid for these three young men that are going to be with him for the whole movie. But he gives us a quite charming rogue sort of character. After he has been healed of his bullet wounds, he begins spinning yarns to these guys about the colorful, romantic life that he leads. Always on the move, riches and friends wherever he goes, and to the audience, we can take these stories with a grain of salt. But to these sheltered boys from the farm, they're fascinated and believe it all. Later in the movie, he becomes very protective of these three, buying them new clothes, horses, and guns, and basically takes them under his wing. And he's not really a father figure to these guys, but more a fun uncle, where they can get away with everything they weren't allowed to back at home, and they see him as this glamorous figure that they wish to emulate. Lee Marvin delivers his dialogue perfectly, and keeps up this easygoing facade, but it can quickly change. Harry Spikes will fly off the handle, telling them off for not keeping watch at camp, threatening to kill a man in a saloon, and in those moments, the real Harry Spikes shines through, a man that looks out only for himself and will do anything to survive. But now, on to the three young men that become his gang. First, there's Will, played by Gary Grimes, and I thought he was pretty great as well. His performance does feel pretty typical of other stuff I've seen him do. This movie was the last of three westerns that all have a coming-of-age element to them. The first being the Culpeper Cattle Company from 1972, then Cahill U.S. Marshal in 1973. In particular, his performance felt really similar to that in Cahill, where he's pretty overconfident with less assured guys his own age, but wary and fearful of the aging westerner that he's around. Lee Marvin here, and John Wayne or even George Kennedy in Cahill. It's a fairly emotional role too, and you can feel the excitement of striking out on your own, but then followed by the regrets and responsibility he feels, particularly after the first completely botched bank robbery they attempt, which I'll talk about later. He and Lee Marvin work really well together, and I have to mention the brief scene where Spikes watches Will cry himself to sleep one night at camp. It plays into the issues that Will has with his father, the reason he ran away from home in the first place, but it's also a great moment for Lee Marvin, because it builds up this bond he has with Will and the others, and that all just reinforces how heartless he becomes later in the film. Ron Howard was also pretty good. I think out of the three, he was given the least to do on a character or acting level at least. His role of Les is a mostly quiet follower, will do whatever Will says, so it's not quite as interesting of a character. I felt Charles Martin Smith was a bit hit and miss in his performance. He plays Todd, maybe the most hesitant and guilt-ridden of the three about what they're doing. In the scenes immediately following that first robbery, I thought he was sort of weak, but they give him not very convincing scenes to play. Mumbling in a daze about accidentally killing someone or moaning while having nightmares about it are pretty on the nose. But then later, I thought he makes certain moments like reading the letter that he's written to his mother in case anything happens to him really moving. So I think it's maybe inadequacies in the script that can take some of the blame. Arthur Honeycutt shows up as the aging gunslinger outlaw character of Kid White. And that scene is fantastic. First of all, it has some of the best dialogue in the movie, and his delivery of lines talking about how he needs a break, needs a bank job to get himself back on his feet, it's perfect. It comes at the perfect time in the movie too, where the gang is feeling pretty good about themselves, they've got everything worked out, and then they see a potential future that lies in store for them. Even if they survive this life they've chosen, the best they can hope for is to be elderly men, broke, scrounging for work, and I think you can see that possibility play out across their faces. The movie is filled with desperate people who have made bad choices, and that scene has all three generations of outlaws. Young, still green and uncertain, middle-aged, confident, riding high, and old and washed up. And that's about as good as it's going to get. Arthur Honeycutt and Lee Marvin are excellent together, and I love the moment where Kid White points out how big the ash pile is for their campfire, exposing the lie that they're only briefly stopping by while riding through. It's little details like that that bring the movie to life and show a knowledge only won by living so long on the range. Noah Berry Jr. shows up briefly in the last act, and I thought he was pretty much wasted. I think he's a really great, really fun character actor. His role as Jim Rockford's dad, Rocky, in The Rockford Files is a perfect example, but his role amounts to a cameo here, which is too bad. There are three main action sequences in the film. The first is the bank robbery that the three boys attempt on their own. It's a well-done scene, portrayed in a very realistic manner. The boys are terrified and in over their heads and make every amateur mistake as you'd expect. They're tripped up by the classic vault only opens on a timer plot device. Ever since the James gang encountered that in Northfield, it's been a staple, and it only gets worse. As I've mentioned, Todd accidentally shoots a man to death as they're escaping, and it's not played in a suspenseful, dramatic way. It just happens, and as an audience member, my stomach just dropped, because you know there's no coming back from that. You're angry at them for their stupidity, but you feel bad for them at the same time because they're not thinking clearly. That dread you feel sort of dissipates once they join up with Spikes, and the movie almost makes you forget about that earlier fiasco. Almost. The second robbery takes place after Spikes has trained them, and I think that is the standout sequence of the movie. Because again, only one thing has to go wrong, and then it all falls apart. What I really appreciated was how even the style of cinematography changes during that scene. Up to this point, it's been filmed pretty much in a standard way, locked down cameras, wide shots, but once the shooting starts, it goes handheld. The angles and the editing becomes a lot more frenetic, and certain shots feel too close, like they've been zoomed in tighter in post. I love the feel of the scene, as well as the running gun battle that takes place right afterwards. In a similar way, the final shootout in the last scene was excellent. I realize this is not a terribly well-known film, so I won't reveal who is present for the gunfight or who wins, anything like that, but it's quick, everyone is shooting wildly, one character goes flying back against a wall, and there too, really well styled and played with a good amount of realism, without becoming gory or overblown. Also, the detail of having gun smoke just pouring out of the room afterwards was just great. The fight happens in a small hotel room with the doors and windows closed, so that was great to include that. Lee Marvin was, again, so great in his last scene. It echoes the storytelling he used on the boys back when they first met, but now with a sour undercurrent running through it. It's great dialogue. And as I've said, there are other scenes where the script felt really well done, but there are other scenes where some lines felt out of place, maybe a bit overwritten, and that's mostly from the three boys at times in the first act. What is supposed to likely sound old-fashioned just comes across as a little awkwardly written. The score was by Fred Karlin, and overall I'd say it was just alright. The music during the riding scenes or other big moments was fairly generic, but during the quiet moments where the boys are talking at camp or wishing they'd never run away in the first place, the subtle underlying score is quite effective. I also wanted to quickly mention the costumes, and other than that of Harry Spikes, most of the costumes felt too modern, especially the hats, vests, and gun belts that the boys are given by Harry. I am a bit of a hypocrite when it comes to Western costumes. I'll criticize something like this for looking far too much like the 70s with the overly curled brims on the hats and that type of thing. But the Cartwright Clan on Bonanza or the Texas Rangers on Laredo, I love all of that. Maybe it's just a case of liking the Western wear of the 50s and 60s more than what came just after, but it is what it is. Harry Spike's costumes are really great though, and it seems like it was chosen with some care. It appears cobbled together to create an outfit that Spike sees as stylish, with his pinstripe jacket, striped shirts, but then rough Western pants. He always has an unfurled pocket square sticking out of his jacket, and I loved how he usually wears only a cartridge belt with his gun tucked into the front, rather than a holster. And his hat, it looks a little out of the norm, but in one scene he puts it on and intentionally flattens one side of the crown. Again, another little detail that shows us Spikes is a man who has cultivated a very particular image for himself. The film has some pretty strong messages running throughout, and it's those that takes it firmly out of the revisionist Western subgenre. It shows the dangers of making impulsive decisions. It could be titled Misspent Youth the Movie, and also cautions you about the trouble with hero worship. I think if anything, it imparts how crucial it is to find good role models, whether that be in your friends or the people you look up to. I really like the ending too. I won't spoil it just in case you haven't seen it, but it plays out in a way that I think, again, is realistic. It's definitely got a heartbreaking aspect to it, and the final shot only makes that hit home even harder, but I think it needed that. Anything else would have felt phony and not in keeping with what came before. The Spikes Gang is a really well-made movie that I've been looking forward to seeing for a long time. It was hard to track down, but I finally found it streaming on Tubi for free. I'm not a streaming guy, I don't check there very regularly, but hopefully it stays on there for a while yet. So if you can find it, I highly recommend checking it out. Thanks for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, please check back to my channel, Hildebrand Productions, for more talk about great westerns. Thanks again, and adios for now.